On behalf of the PKE Alumni Executive Planning Committee, I would like to wish everyone a good afternoon. I am Alan Goad, CEO of Motivo Engineering and a member of the PKE family through class 120. At this time, I would like to welcome you to the PKE Faculty Speaker Series with one of our favorite professors, Dr. John Scully. I will tell you, 14 years after his class, I still utilize his spreadsheet templates for my own businesses. And think about him quite often when I'm doing it. This talk today is entitled Stockholders, Stakeholders, and Often Overlooked Exit Alternatives. I would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded. Before we get started, I would like to thank my fellow PKE Executive Planning Committee members, Bill Barkowitz, President of Transcend Systems, Corporation from PKE Class 139, Jeanette Nakandakari, CEO of MyHR from PKE Class 139, and Amy Towner, CEO of Healthcare Foundation Ventura County from PKE Class 139. As a special note, please don't forget to join us on PEP Connect at connect.pepperdine.edu. This is where you will find our exclusive PKE community and where we post PKE specific events and information. If you are searching for other ways to help our PKE community stay strong and continue to grow, we have a program where you can refer a prospective PKE student for a $2,500 scholarship. We also encourage everyone for you to recommend candidates for other Pepperdine degree programs as well. But for the scholarship, they need to be entered into the PKE. Pepperdine Pearl Quintana, the Associate Director of PKE Programs, information is on the screen, and she'll be happy to help you with both of these requests. We'd like to also acknowledge and thank our executive associates who support the Graziadio Business School in its philanthropic efforts. And then at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Smith, Professor of Economics, Associate Provost of Online Programs, and Chair of the PKE Faculty Committee, who will provide a Pepperdine update and introduce Dr. John Scully.
Thank you very much, Alan. I appreciate that. In addition to my role with the Provost's office, I have the privilege of serving with the PKE committee, and I'm pleased to announce that next week we are kicking off our 48th cohort of the PKE program, and the quality and composition of this group is really very outstanding. I wish I had the time just to list just the impressive credentials that this new cohort has from PKE graduates. So it really speaks to the quality of individuals that you are recommending be brought forward, and we're very grateful for that. We look forward to kicking off another PKE cohort in the fall, so we continue to lean on you for your recommendations to bring in high quality students that can help us continue to sustain and build on the past successes of PKE. We're soon getting close to the 150th cohort of this very special and unique program. It's my privilege and honor to work with one of your outstanding faculty members on the PKE faculty committee, and that is John Scully. John is a board member and co-founder of Ecliptic Enterprises Corporation, an organization focusing on space avionics and sensor systems. From 2001 to 2017, Dr. Scully also served as Ecliptic's CFO. His professional
it looks like we may have lost Nicole and Dr. Smith.
I'm back. Can you hear me? This is Dave.
Yes, we can hear you. My screen may have frozen too. I apologize.
It
I'm
all
so
happened at the same time.
Anyway, I think I was in the middle of introducing my outstanding colleague, John Scully. I'll put the remainder of his introduction in the chat. You all know him as an outstanding professor at the PKE program. So with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And let me share my screen. Okay. Is my screen showing okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's great to see everybody today. A lot of familiar faces here. And as Dave mentioned, we're going to be talking about shareholders, stakeholders, and an often overlooked exit alternative. And let me just mention one of the things in my bio that Dave was probably going to mention, we didn't get cut off there, is that I've been involved with an organization called First Flight Venture Center here in the Research Triangle Park, and had the opportunity this week to have a couple of companies come in, very early stage biotech companies who are in the process of trying to raise a lot of money. They're pre-revenue, but it was interesting how much of the discussion already went to asking them about their exits. What are their planned exits? They're just in the initial stages of raising money. So this issue of exits is real important. So if we think about those folks as one end of the spectrum, out there just trying to raise initial money, getting questions from people about their exit strategy. Today, we're going to concentrate on the other end of the spectrum. People have had businesses, grown those businesses, and thinking about their upcoming exits. So kind of a compelling statistic here that baby boomers own about half of all privately held companies with employees in the US. This excludes sole practitioners, single consultants, et cetera. The 2.4 million business owners who belong to this aging demographic, 1/3 of them have already passed 65, are going to need exit strategy. So there's a wave, and it's not just coming, it's here already, about how are these individuals going to exit. What I'd like to talk about today is not just this exit for these mature companies and the owners of these mature companies, but connecting this to the issue that's sort of gained a lot of traction lately about the involving stakeholders and not just stockholders into our enterprises. So what I'd like to look at is a solution that maybe can help some of these exiting individuals, people who want to exit their businesses, especially more mature individuals, and also to trying to get greater stakeholder involvement in our businesses. Just a comment here from McKinsey & Company this is actually from last year, about serving stakeholders if done correctly could be a source of competitive advantage. For example, companies focused on stakeholder principle of protecting employment, quote, are primed to pick up market share when their competitors train new employees and try to catch up. And we can think about this was a year ago, and we probably all know in the past year it's become harder to keep employees and to find new ones. So there is apparently an advantage here that they're saying if we can keep employee stakeholders engaged. Sort of the classic view, comparing stockholders to stakeholders, Milton Friedman, probably the best known. If you go back, I won't read the whole quote here, but effectively, Milton Friedman stressed that stockholders, the board of directors and stockholders should primarily be interested in creating wealth for the stockholders. Being involved and engaged with social issues of social responsibility was not their purview. Now, it wasn't that he was a terribly callous person, but he believed that when people were concerned about those issues, they should be doing so as individuals, as opposed to as officers or directors of companies. And of course, around 2019, this changed. Again, I'm not going to read this whole slide, but where the Business Roundtable, which is the CEOs of large publicly traded companies, took the position that, hey, Milton Friedman model doesn't work anymore. We really need to be focused on stakeholders. So again, I'm not going to read it all, but the parts that are in bold, I think, are worth saying that this is how they see the commitment of themselves and their organizations for delivering value to our customers, investing in our employees, dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers, supporting the communities we serve, the communities in which we work. And then finally, generating long-term value for shareholders. It's kind of interesting. They dropped that long-term value for shareholders down to the last position. So a complete inversion of the Milton Friedman model. So the last part here, again, this is all part of the quote. Each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them for the future success of our companies, our communities, our country. And, you know, at one level, I don't think there's much disagreement among any of us about that goal. The challenge, though, is how's that value going to be divided up? You know, where do the resources of the company get used, and how do you prioritize them? So let's just stick with just the stockholder view, the Milton Friedman view, and just realize the difficulties encountered there. Again, fundamentally, the issue is stockholders elect the directors, who in turn appoint the officers of the company. The challenge is not all stockholders have the same goals or perspectives. For example, some may be concerned about capital reinvestment. Some may be more concerned about generating cash flow or dividends. Some may be concerned about an exit, just wanting to completely take the risk off the table. And when we think about, you know, cash flow and dividends, we don't want to forget too that a lot of times these individuals are also employees of the company. So, you know, they're going to have an interest there in their employment. So got lots of competing interests, even among stockholders. You know, for example, if a stockholder is someone in the company, relying on the company for employment, or someone from the outside that may be just looking at it, how do they maximize their wealth? And of course, one other complexity is the tax code. You know, given whether or not you're being taxed on current earnings or long-term capital gains, you make a difference to you in terms of the wealth that actually gets passed on to you as a stockholder. So how does the board go about dealing with these competing interests? Now, again, as I mentioned, you know, some people may be concerned about wanting to get an exit to get the risk off the table. Some may be concerned about current liquidity. The challenge comes in when we start making this more complicated. We start considering about, you know, the interests of employees, customers and suppliers, the general community. And moreover, if we're thinking about allocating resources to some of these parties, especially if you're an investor, where the return to the investor may not be so apparent. Maybe they're in principle, maybe they're big picture, but when you actually try to quantify these issues, you know, how do you take care of some of these other parties where, you know, again, might be selfishly there as a director wanting to protect your own self-interest and your long-term net worth. So what I'd like to do is we've got this may look a little daunting. It looks like 6 questions, but there's really only 3. The odd number ones ask you to just respond yes, no, about yourself. How would you feel about questions 1, 3, and 5? Questions 2, 4, and 6 ask you to just comment about how you feel most employees would feel about these issues. So if you could just take a second, and if you could put up the polling questions, Nicole, can you do that? Thank you.
Sorry, we had to relaunch it, so it should be there. Just scroll through from 1 to 6. If you scroll down, you'll see all 6 questions. Thank you.
And Nicole, maybe you can be the high sign when you think we've gotten most responses in. We'll take a look at the answers in a little while.
Will do. Yes, we have about a little less than half. So we're still getting some entries in.
And just while we're finishing up, I'll send Nicole this presentation afterwards so she can circulate it to everyone. Anybody wants to take a look at this later?
Great. I think we have a good amount in, so I will go ahead and close the polling.
Okay, thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome.
So I want to just reference a discussion here, the Keenan Institute at the University of North Carolina. One way of helping to address this issue of stakeholder value is they looked particularly at the family firm, meaning family-owned businesses. And they believe that they actually provide a blueprint for addressing the issue of what they call stakeholder capitalism, sort of connecting the shareholder and the stakeholder interests. They recognize that they're not perfectly aligned, but they believe that family firms typically have a long-term view, an idea about where they're going over other firms. And they believe that this vision can be very attractive to employees because employees have a sense of where they're going, a sense of a commitment from the company to them, and in turn, they commit back to the company. Again, I think there may be a lot of benefits to this approach, but the one thing it still doesn't address is that you could have the competing interests within the family firm. Not all the individuals there may have the same interests. Again, you may run into one or more people within the family firm that, yes, they believe in the long-term goals and perspectives of the company, but they may have liquidity needs, which may encourage them to liquidate the firm or find an outside buyer. So you can still have the tension here. So the question today that I'd like to look at is going to concentrate really on two groups of stakeholders, owners or investors and employees, and see whether or not there's an opportunity for a win-win that could bring liquidity to owners, because that's often the challenge with privately held businesses. How do you get liquidity to the people that have built the wealth? Where they would still maybe be able to maintain control of the company. But here's the good part. It can possibly get a significant stake in the long-term wealth creation of the organization into the hands of employees. Just a caution here that we're going to be looking at a scenario that can be a little bit complicated, and the condition, what's actually needed if you decided yourself to pursue this idea will depend on your actual facts and circumstances. And if you are interested, you clearly would want to get help in the tax area, legal areas, and ERISA, Employee Retirement and Income Security Act professionals to help you design a detailed plan for yourself. What I want to do today is just sort of give an overview of a particular type of ESOP that may be a valuable alternative for some folks looking for that exit, looking for liquidity, I guess, but not necessarily leaving the company. Okay. How did I get interested in this topic? Well, like all of us during the COVID lockdown, faced an alternative. Am I going to sit here and watch TV or do something else? So I decided to pursue my CFP, Certified Financial Planning certification. Most of my background, as a lot of you know, has been in corporate accounting and finance. Never really spent a lot of time on personal financial planning, so I went down that road. But during this experience, so part of this program, this discussion of the plan we're going to be talking about today, it brought to mind the UPS, United Parcel Service, IPO case that some of us use in PKE, where there was a significant employee ownership in the company, and many people worked their way up the ranks and left with significant wealth at the end of their careers. In 2009, I coordinated an alumni event. It was just specifically on exit alternatives, and this topic was discussed. Had a consulting engagement down in Orange County a few years back, and although I was not particularly engaged on this side of the project, I got a chance to witness what this company was doing, trying to pursue this sort of retirement and exit plan. And I hate to say it, but years ago, I worked at a company, West and Beck, early in my career, where they had one of these plans. And I'll be honest with you, at the time, it was so complicated, and I know I didn't really understand it, so I kind of ignored it. So a little bit of guilt there, and hopefully today's discussion will make it a little bit clearer to people about what's going on. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about an employee stock ownership plan. And let me just mention, this sounds a lot like an employee stock purchase plan, which a lot of publicly traded companies have. This is an employee stock purchase plan. You have a certain amount withheld from your paycheck, and you get shares at a discounted price. This is a very different program. We'll go through the details. And what we're going to talk about is basic structure, and we're going to talk about it as being leveraged. And that's where the real power of this model comes in for an exit strategy. So just want to walk through the steps of the diagram. So again, we're not going to get into a whole bunch of different diagrams. This is a basic diagram. We're just going to go through the steps, which are numbered in blue to the left and described on the right. So the first step in this is the company obtains a loan from a lender. And the ESOP, employee stock ownership plan, can sometimes get the loan, but my understanding is in most cases, it's the company that gets the loan. And in some cases, the shareholders can also be the lenders. But for simplicity, let's assume the company goes out, gets a loan from a bank. Step two, the company in turn lends the money to the ESOP. So your employer goes out, borrows money, transfers that money into the ESOP trust. At this point, the cash goes over to the ESOP, and the ESOP actually on its books records a liability back to the company. So far, not terribly interesting, but here's where the fun part starts to come in. Step three, the ESOP then makes a cash payment to the shareholders and effectively writes a check to them. And the shareholders turn over shares to the ESOP. Now, here's where some of the power of this comes in. Not all shareholders need to sell their shares. This can be done on a partial basis. So let's say you have 2 or 3 founders of the company, and one's interested in exiting, but the other 2 want to maintain their position and grow with the company. You could arrange this so it's just that one shareholder, or it could be letting all 3 shareholders in the scenario take some of their stake off the table and cash in. There is an alternative here where the shareholders could buy, where the ESOP could buy the shares directly from the company. That can have value as well, but it's probably the less interesting than the type of scenario we're talking about, where the cash goes from the ESOP trust over to the shareholders. So 3 big concerns are going to come up in this process. We're at the first one already, the valuation of those shares. In other words, this is a transaction where the cash is going from a lender to the company to the trust, off to the shareholders. So the price that the ESOP pays for those shares is very important. And in particular here, because we've got the Department of Labor and we can have the IRS looking over our shoulders, plus there's a responsibility to the employees here about how the funds are being spent. So the big concern is, what's the value of those shares? Step 4 is how does this loan ever get paid off? And this is one of the other interesting aspects of this. The company, out of their cash flow each year, makes a periodic payment to the ESOP. Now, when the company makes these payments to the ESOP, that total contribution to the ESOP is tax deductible. And just jumping ahead a little bit, the ESOP takes the money and pays off the loan. It pays off principal and interest. But notice what the company gets. The company gets a tax deduction for the full amount of the money of the payment into the ESOP. So think about this. This is like if you took out a mortgage on your house and you got to deduct not just the interest, but the principal as well. So from the company's perspective, they're getting the full deduction of principal and interest. A very powerful incentive for the company. The concern here, though, is a big concern area number 2 is as you think about implementing that ESOP, is these periodic payments that take place in step 4, is you've got to really have a company that's mature enough in generating cash flow to service that loan. Otherwise, this becomes a mess. So, probably this isn't going to work with an immature company or a company that's not fairly stable. But in a stable organization, that has the wherewithal to borrow funds on a regular basis to fund their operations, this gives them the advantage of having the deduction, not just for the interest, but for the principal as well. And again, too, if you're the CEO of the company, if you're a board member of the company, essentially you're getting the rewards of this as well because you're selling your shares back to the company. As we mentioned before, in step 5, the ESOP uses the money then to pay off the principal and interest. And again, the big plus here is getting the tax deductibility. And if you think about this too, like in the early, let's say if it's like our mortgages and you pay a little bit of principal, a little bit of interest each year, when a company typically borrows the money, they get the benefit of the tax deduction in the early years with the high interest. And then it becomes reduced later on because it's mostly principal payment, not much there available for deduction. But here you get the deduction for the full amount on a consistent basis all the way through, which can be very powerful. So what happens as the company pays off, as the ESOP pays off its loan to the company, it then allocates shares to individuals, typically based on compensation. There's some restrictions, so there's a maximum amount, the ceiling about what can be used in prorating the allocation. Notice that typically the shares are not allocated to the individual per se until they leave the company. One key question comes up though, what happens if an issue comes up for a vote before the shares are actually distributed to the employees? If you're not a publicly traded company, typically the trustee of the ESOP will vote those shares. So the trustee's in a very powerful position, other than issues typically like related to M&A or dissolving the company, then in which case the individuals that are entitled to shares in the ESOP would get the voting rights. Now, so the shares are in there. So how do the employees actually get money? How do they actually get it? Well, typically the funds have to stay in the ESOP, these shares have to stay in the ESOP until you either retire, or there can be exceptions for serious health events like health issues, etc. But when you leave, and let's take the typical situation when you exit from the company, it could be in the form of shares, cash or shares, and it can be a lump sum, or it can be periodic payments, no less than annually, and typically no more than 5 years. Okay? So in other words, what you'll be doing is as you're working the company over the years, the shares will be allocated to you along the way as the company pays down the loan. And then when you leave the company, you'll either get shares or you'll get cash. Now, obviously, probably one question we're all thinking about is, that's great if it's a publicly traded company, you can turn around and sell those shares. What happens if you're not? If you're a privately held company, how do you now get liquidity out of that? You didn't want to just move the liquidity problem from the existing owners and now to an employee that there's viewing this as maybe part of funding his or her retirement, and they have shares in a non-publicly traded company. So if you're not a publicly traded company, you essentially get a put option, which means you get the right as an employee or a retired employee to have the company repurchase your shares. In other words, allowing you to sell them back at the then fair market value. Okay, so in other words, you would be selling them back, and it has to be provided to you at least twice a year, the option to do so. Okay. And now here, there's even more goodies here. I mean, so if you think about our government here, they really are incentivizing this whole process. So a couple of things from the employee perspective, you get possible capital gains benefit, because while those shares are in the trust and allocated to you, but you haven't yet cashed them in, that you get to recognize a capital gains on what's called the net unrealized appreciation for the amount those shares appreciated while you were working and they were sitting in the trust. And moreover, when you leave, if let's say you say, I want to cash out, you can take that cash and roll it into an IRA and still defer your taxes off to a future time. So again, lots of tax benefits here, capital gains treatment possibility, or also the ability to defer the tax by rolling into an IRA after you leave. There's even more goodies here. From the seller side, in other words, the shareholders that sell up here, if the company is a C Corp, and after the sale, the ESOP holds 30% more of the shares of each class, or 30% of the value of all the shares, the seller can reinvest those shares into what's called QRP, or qualified replacement property, which is typically buying the stock of a company, a real operating company. And they don't have to pay tax until they would actually sell those shares. So if you think about this, today they have shares in a company that aren't liquid. The ESOP allows them to get liquidity by virtue of selling the shares to the ESOP. But then you could be facing a big taxable event. Well, if you qualify under these conditions, you could then go out and buy like shares of Exxon and not have to pay any tax on that, pay the capital gains tax until you actually sell those shares later on. So it gets you into a liquid position and also possibly being able to defer your taxes. So there's a lot of win-wins here for everybody on this program. Again, repeating for employees, there are tax benefits over on that side. So there are benefits for both the employees, there's benefits for the shareholders, and there's benefits for the companies in terms of tax deductions. So where are we? So again, just another statistic, in 2020, there were 6,600 companies that had ESOPs with roughly 10.6 million participants. Now, one question that comes up is, okay, you got a lot of IRS rules you have to comply with, Department of Labor rules. Why not just sell the company to management? Well, one big reason is management may not have the financial wherewithal to buy the company, okay? You may be a little reluctant to finance them as the owner because you may have needs for liquidity yourself. So what this does do is it helps supply the liquidity really for management employees to take over the company. And hopefully if they're aligned with your values, then you'll have this consistency going forward. But notice too that even if you don't want to totally exit, you could say, for example, sell 20% of your shares to the ESOP, get yourself some liquidity, and still be essentially in control of the company on a day-to-day basis. Then one of the downsides is it's a form of defined contribution plan. If we think, a lot of us are familiar with 401k plans, that's sort of the classic defined contribution plan. And ESOP is actually a version of this. And as you may be aware that if you've ever worked with a 401k and you don't do the safe harbor provisions, possibly because you're small and you're a little bit concerned about committing to matching, et cetera, the rules can get pretty complicated. So just similarly, the same thing can happen here with an ESOP, some rules to follow that are important. And then again, too, in some of our classes, I know we talked about our famous revenue ruling 5960. And this is the IRS ruling, which pops up in all kinds of places, and including with ESOPs. And talking about the pricing of shares, it's the amount at which the property would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller. So what can happen here is you're always subject to second guessing. Yes, the ESOP bought the shares at $2 a piece, but is that what a willing buyer and a willing seller would pay? So recognizing this, there are a lot of closely involved people here. So you do have the IRS that can come in and question the transaction if they feel like an unfair price was paid, meaning unfair to the employees about what price was paid for the shares. So you think about, like with any trust, ESOP trustee has a lot of responsibility. He or she will be voting the ESOP shares along the way. They've got to manage the day-to-day trust. They got to determine the price paid for the shares and commit that it's a fair price. When the stock price adjusts annually and shares are being repurchased from employees, they have to establish that price. They're responsible for all the compliance and plan documents and complying with all the rules, make sure the proper allocation takes place, that each of the participants get the right number of shares. But the National Center for Employee Ownership, NCEO, a great organization located up in Oakland, did a 10-year study of ESOP litigation of closely held organizations. That's where the big concern is. When the parties are close, a small company, are things going wrong? And what they said is their study showed that the risk of being a trustee in an ESOP with a high-quality team of advisors and a good third-party administrator are extremely low. So again, yes, there's a lot of compliance issues to deal with, but what their findings were that there's a lot of anecdotal horror stories out there, but they found that the companies that do invest in good advisors, get a good third-party administrator, that the risks aren't that great. There's a bigger picture too here that, again, referring back to the Keenan Institute, this time on their Institute on Private Enterprise. We think that a lot of effort has been directed towards trying to improve issues of wealth inequality, but what they find is that 50% of the households now hold just 2% of the wealth of the country, down from 4% in 1990. So in other words, proportionally, the bottom 50% has become poor. And the top 1% now earn 31% of the wealth, an increase from 23% in 1990. So if we are concerned about wealth inequality, so far it's not working what we've done. And the possibility of devices such as an Esop, where an individual has a chance to accumulate, and remember too, this is no out of pocket to the employee. These are just allocation, and really the incentive for the employees, the trick is to have the value of these shares increase over time. That's why their wealth increases. So it should be an incentive for them. What they're looking for, the Keenan Institute is looking for, how do we incorporate stakeholder interests into influencing the business and getting them some returns. The question they ask though is, will employees, rather than just asking management to solve stakeholder issues, will they really want to become engaged in the process? To me, this is an interesting question worth exploring. A lot of times I think we all know employees approach a job as a job, not particularly concerned about how things are run or how things are going. I do wonder now that, with more and more remote working, what will be the long-term commitment for each of us will just be, okay, doing a spreadsheet, these are the plus and minuses of this job. I'm working from home anyway, what difference does it make what company I work for? Or will we be able to keep employee engagement there? And again, too, for a lot of folks, I think the ESOP is a way to try to do this. Let me, just because we are starting to run a little bit of time, maybe just open it up for maybe a couple quicker reactions. So just feel free to unmute. Do we think that an ESOP could be a vehicle for helping to reduce wealth inequality? See some heads nodding. Do we think, well, let's go to the third one, because it's probably the most important. That do we think, because let me back up here. The idea with an ESOP isn't just intended to be another retirement plan for employees. The goal of the legislation was really to drive employee engagement, getting employees involved with the business. And I guess I just asked for a gut reaction, especially as we move towards more and more of a remote working environment, which is subject to change. It might all change tomorrow too. Do we see employees really wanting to get engaged and become change agents within their companies? Or do we think they're going to be just becoming more passive? I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts?
Yeah, hi, Dr. Scully. This is Bill Markovitz.
Bill.
Hi. Yeah, my feeling is that anytime you provide some type of ownership, so whether it's an ESOP or profit sharing or stock options, I believe that employees, at least from my experience, the places that I've worked, are going to definitely be more engaged and think more about the company's money as their own money and their time more wisely. So that's what I think.
I agree with you, Bill. And let me say too, I think one of the things that I find attractive about the ESOP is, at least a number of the places where I work, the stock options, at least significant amounts of them, tend to stay with the senior people. And the ESOP, one of the benefits is this gets us down to everybody in the company. Essentially, you can't discriminate, and the rules get a little complicated. But essentially, if you're there and you're working 1,000 hours a year, you're in. And so you're getting the benefit of the appreciation of the stock price. So I agree with you. I think stock options or stock grants also tend to be pretty good incentivizers. But challenge is a lot of times they don't get down to everybody. And this is one where it automatically goes essentially to everyone.
Hey, Dr. Scully, it's Tim Moore. Good afternoon.
Oh, hi, Tim. How you doing?
Hey, good to see you. I agree with both of you. I think it absolutely adds a lot of value. And in today's day and age, it's harder to recruit and attract talent. I think this could be a competitive advantage for companies that adopt something like this. So I think absolutely yes.
Great. And again, too, I think most of us agree. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for it. So good. I'm glad to hear some agreement here.
Hey, John, this is Catherine Bingham. How are you doing?
Hi, Catherine. Good to see you.
So I do agree, but I still also agree that some of the engagement is going to be moderated by other factors, right? Because if there's a culture that creates a dynamic that's not supporting employees in some way, and yet you have this financial incentive or this ownership incentive, you still may not get enough out of it to overcome the other factors that are occurring. So I think, yes, in the right environment, this is a great way of transferring and being able to, create some additional engagement, especially if, and I've seen it done, where they include some really good education programs to go with, so that employees understand their contributions and how they connect back to the performance of the company. And then that in turn helps them know why, this is of benefit to them and how they influence it with their day-to-day activities. So I think there's two pieces of it. Yes, I agree on one hand, but I also know that, we look at this great resignation, so to speak, and there are many other factors today that people are considering. And if those elements of culture and appreciation for the employees' needs beyond this piece aren't there, I don't know that you're going to overcome it with an ESOP plan.
And Catherine, that leads in a perfect lead into the next slide. In this group, this National Center for Employee Ownership, which is really dedicated to this whole idea. They make this point here that it's really about commitment. And what they mean is commitment by management. And some of the folks involved there that I've had a chance to meet with, these folks were involved in writing the original legislation. They recognize that there's a lot of goodies in here for owners of a company, that people start a company, own it, and some tax advantages to them. But what they're saying, what you really got to do is you've got to commit to this. You've got to commit to being open and doing exactly like you're saying, Catherine, providing the training, helping people to understand what this means. And I'll say firsthand in my experience, back in the 80s, I remember hearing, we had an ESOP, but the little bit I heard about it was so complicated, I kind of threw up my hands, and the organization really didn't make a big effort at it. But here, what they're pointing out is here, if you're going down this road and you don't really try to get your employees engaged, they're saying sooner or later they'll become disenchanted with it, and it'll just be, a retirement plan, which is not bad. I mean, that's good in itself, and an additional retirement plan. Nobody's going to complain about that. But if you really want to see this succeed, it's really employee engagement that's going to be the key. And they put the commitment really starts with management and the ownership of the company, to commit to passing on the ownership and the management of the company to the next generation, to new people. So a very good point. Agree with that. Maybe if I could ask you, Nicole, maybe if we could just bring up the survey, maybe this would be a good spot just to see how we answered on the 6 questions. And did we lose? So on question 1, would you be willing to trade off a current portion of compensation for greater assurance of long-term employment? It looks like about a 50-50 split there. On the second question, oops. Stronger no when we go to most employees. So it's kind of interesting that it sounds like we're not as optimistic as other employees. Would it help increase alignment of values? It seems like we agree strongly for ourselves, and we think for most employees too, that when they're aligned with the management of the company. And again, that's what part of the ESOP is intended to do, to get management, stockholders, and employees into alignment. Would you be willing to trade off some current portion of your compensation for long-term equity stake? Strong support among group here. A little less confidence in the overall employees overall about being willing to do so. Interesting. Great. Just moving on a little bit. Again, just some questions for business owners to consider. If you are thinking, if you have your own business, who do you want to run it after you're gone? Unfortunately, at some point we all leave. Is the culture of your organization one that would embrace employee participation ownership? And also too, again, if you are thinking about considering ESOP, you will need to think about the long-term economic outlook for your business and the industry, because a loan, especially if it's a leveraged loan, a leveraged ESOP, you have to be thinking about how it's funded. And just a question for individuals here that they are involved with an ownership position of a company, would it be right for you and for your organization? Just a quick update here. There is legislation here. Most of the legislation related to ESOPs goes back to the 1980s, but there is a legislation working its way through the House of Representatives, and as I understand, has strong bipartisan support and support from the administration, which will commit additional funding. And what the funding will do is actually authorize states. So I think this is a good thing. They're getting it down into the states so that you're not just dealing with Washington, to help develop education and outreach to inform employers and employees of the benefits of employee ownership. There's a lot of employers that need to understand that maybe there's some benefit for the employees having an equity stake in the company. Providing additional technical assistance for guiding employees to become business owners. And I think that's the main driver of this legislation, is looking at how to get employees to become business owners, educating business owners about using employee ownership for business transition. Effectively, I think that's a not so subtle message about, hey, think about this ESOP and the benefits that it may have for you and for your long-term legacy, about what you might be doing for your employees and their families to get them to be part of the ownership community and not just somebody working at your company. And also providing resources for creating a personal finance education portal. And I think that's going to be spelled out a little bit more in some additional detail. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'll wrap up in a few minutes here, but I wanted to first turn it over to Alan for a few minutes. Alan, any thoughts, questions you'd like to throw out here? And I do know you were going to just mention something about upcoming PKE events.
Yes, we want to bring it to everybody's attention that we have a summer PKE mixer that is scheduled for July 16th. We have the date set. We have a speaker and we have a location. All is going to be unveiled. So look for the registration notice to come into your email box and make sure you register to attend. Looking forward to actually getting to see everybody in person on July 16th. So mark it in your calendar and be sure to be in the LA area for the event.
Great, thank you, Al. Anybody have any questions, concerns, thoughts? I know that the diagrams can be a little tricky. I guess, I didn't want to dwell on that too much, but I did want to just get out there that there may be a model here. Again, we talk about stakeholder interest. I mean, just to recap, the challenge is, yes, everybody like to see everybody win, but that's not the easiest thing to do. Again, because most of us, by their nature, including myself strongly, are self-interested. But it does seem like this is one of those vehicles that it's hard to see who loses. It's hard to see. There's something in there for the stockholders, especially of privately held companies. This is a way to get you liquidity. This is a way to help you defer capital gains taxes. Wow. So I don't really need to be taxed until I really need the cash out there. It's a way of letting me get out there. It's a way in which it helps the company to get a bigger tax deduction. It's a real incentive here. You're out there, you're borrowing the money, and you're giving it an employee benefit, and you're getting to deduct the principal and interest effectively. And for employees, if your company's successful and it grows over time, the stock becomes more and more valuable. As it did with UPS employees, a lot of drivers left UPS as very wealthy individuals who started young there. And then moreover, for those individuals, it's not like, okay, I helped create this value, and then I'm leaving and I got this huge tax bill. No, wait a second, I can roll it over into my IRA and then just become taxed when I actually need the money. So lots of incentives there. So again, would have been nice if the laws were a little less complicated, But it is interesting to see that it does seem Congress is looking at this. I think it's a statement that there's buy-in on both sides of the aisle. Now, how can they help companies actually implement it? And I personally, I think the tax incentives are there. What the incentive needs to be is to help people deal with the process. You know, hey, where do I get resources? How do I get help? How do I understand this? And again, too, if you're an owner, how do I understand the pluses and minuses? You know, I don't want to be sitting there reading legislation. Is there a resource I can go to help me really understand the details? Are there unique problems about my company why I don't want to do this, you know, to avoid the regrets? Because I do think some companies shy away just because it's something different, it's unusual. I don't want to find out that I made a mistake later. But again, it does seem like it's an idea worth reviving here. So great. So if no one has any questions, Nicole, I will send you the slides as soon as we wrap up here, and that you can send out to everybody. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I appreciate you being here. It's good to see everybody. And I also want to thank everybody too. I know some individuals know this, but not everybody. I'll be leaving Pepperdine at the end of July. It's been great to work with everybody. As I shared with my department chair, having the privilege to teach in PKE has been one of the highlights of my career. Both in terms of the environment, I think those of us that have gone through PKE, it's unique, it's great, it's collaborative, it's heated discussions, it's thoughtful people, it's a wide range of perspectives, and it's a great experience. And the greatest part has been the people in the class. And I must say how much I've learned from each and every one. That, you know, being in PKE, as I said, it's been a highlight. If I think about all the educational experiences I've had, being involved with PKE has been one of the greatest, just to be exposed to so many bright, energetic, enthusiastic people. And I know it'll continue on. And I'll be updating the spreadsheet still. So if anybody ever needs an updated copy, don't hesitate to holler. And with that, Nicole, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for this presentation. I don't know if there are anyone that wants to give some kind words, as this may be our last interaction with you. We do have a PKE event, 2 of them in July, and we'd love to see you there. But I see in the chat there's some communication. We also have an event survey that I will launch just for your feedback as we move forward with the PKE sessions and looking at more faculty speaker series, maybe involving alumni in some aspect of that. And so we'd love to get your feedback, but we are ever grateful for you and all that you shared today. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you very much, everyone. Great to see you all today, and a great experience for me working with everybody.